Prime Minister Netanyahu, who is to blame for the militants' attack on Israel, writes Seymour Hersh on the Substack platform. It was Bibi's belief that he would keep Hamas in check that jeopardized the country's security and led to the bloody war. The journalist argues, Bibi's doctrine, with his belief that he will keep Hamas in check, has not only jeopardized Israel's security, but has led to a bloody war. Decades ago, I spent 3 years on a book, The Samson Option, in which I exposed the unspoken policy of American presidents beginning with Dwight Eisenhower, all of whom looked the other way when Israel began building the atomic bomb. The point of the book is not what is right or wrong for Israel after the Holocaust. The point I was trying to make was that America's approach was well known throughout the Third World, as it was then called, and our duplicitous concerns about nuclear proliferation were another colorful example of American hypocrisy. Since then, other countries have undertaken much more in-depth research, as some of Israel's and the US's most secret documents have been made public. I decided not to go to Israel to gather information so as not to violate the national security laws there, but I did find Israelis abroad who were working on a secret project. They were willing to talk to me as soon as they learned that I had information from the American intelligence archives. The people who worked on such sensitive material have remained loyal to Israel, and some of them have become lifelong friends. At the same time, they maintain close ties with former colleagues who remained in Israel. What follows is a look at last week's grisly events from a veteran of Israel's national security apparatus who is well aware of their background. The main conclusion to be drawn, the Israeli knowledgeable source told me, is that Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu is finished. He is a living corpse. He will only stay in office until the shooting stops, maybe another month or two, he said. Netanyahu served as Prime Minister from 1996 to 1999, then again from 2009 to 2021, already as leader of the right-wing Likud party, before returning for a third term at the end of 2022. Bibi has always been against the 1993 Oslo Accords, the source said. They gave the Palestinian Authority formal control over both the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. Upon returning as Prime Minister in 2009, my interlocutor reported, Bibi decided to support Hamas as an alternative to the Palestinian Authority, gave them money and sat them down in the Gaza Strip. An arrangement was made with Qatar, which, with Israeli approval, began sending hundreds of millions of dollars to the Hamas leadership. A source told me that Bibi believed that with Qatari money he could control Hamas, allowing them to occasionally fire rockets into southern Israel and giving some jobs in Israel tighter than the Palestinian Authority. He deliberately took that risk. What happened this week, the source said, is a fruit of Bibi's doctrine that you can create a Frankenstein and he will obey you. The Hamas attack was a direct result of Bibi's decision over the protests of the military to allow a group of Orthodox settlers to celebrate Sukkot in the West Bank. Sukkot, or the Feast of Tabernacles, commemorates the Jews' wanderings through the Sinai Desert. During the week-long celebration, a temporary dwelling sukkah is erected in the open air where people eat traditional foods and intuitively experience the harvest season. However, this request comes at a time of extreme tension due to a recent incident in the West Bank when Jewish settlers, according to the Associated Press, stormed into a settlement that became the epicenter of clashes on October 6 and killed a 19-year-old Arab man. The young man's death, the Associated Press report said, marked the latest spike in violence in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, which claimed nearly 200 Palestinian lives last year, the highest annual toll in nearly 2 decades. Sukkot celebrations near the Palestinian village of Huwara required extraordinary precautions, given the general tension amid the recent bloodshed, and the local military, with Netanyahu's approval, withdrew 2 of 3 battalions, each of about 800 soldiers, from the border with the Gaza Strip and redeployed to the West Bank. As a result, there are only 800 soldiers left for the entire 51-kilometer border between the Gaza Strip and southern Israel. The source told me, the residents of the south were thus left without a military presence for 10 to 12 hours. They have been abandoned to their fate. And that's why Bibi is finished. He will hold on for a few more months, but he's still finished. My interlocutor called the strike on southern Israel the greatest military failure in the country's history. Recalling that in the 1973 war only soldiers died, he was referring to the Doomsday War, a surprise attack on the Yom Kippur holiday, in which Israel was briefly overrun by Egyptian and Syrian forces. Last Saturday, as many as 22 settlements in the south fell under Hamas control for several hours, and militants went from house to house shooting women and children, he said. A military response is coming, he said, noting that 360 reservists have already been called up. A heated debate has broken out over strategy. The Israeli Air Force and Navy Special Forces are ready for action, but Bibi and the military leadership have always favored high-tech services. The regular army has been used mainly for security in the West Bank. The reality is that the ground forces are simply not trained for combat. Don't get it wrong, their fighting spirit is not in doubt, but their success in the special situation that soldiers will face in a ground operation in the ruins of bombed Gaza is questionable. The source said, the reservists are now undergoing accelerated training and a further decision could be made by the end of this week. The source said, meanwhile, the current bombardment of civilian targets, residences, hospitals and mosques does not even pretend to be a symbolic concern for civilians. During previous strikes on Gaza, he said, the Israeli Air Force often dropped only small bombs on civilian targets. This was called tapping the roof. Theoretically, residents had time to flee. This is not the case with the current round-the-clock bombing. As for a ground operation, the source said, a brutal alternative, which could be called the Leningrad option, is also being considered. In World War II, the Nazis besieged and tried to starve Leningrad, now St. Petersburg, to death. The Nazi blockade lasted nearly 900 days, and the death toll was at least 800,000, possibly more. The Hamas leadership and most of the militants are known to be hiding underground. Therefore, Israel's goal is to eliminate as many insurgents as possible without resorting to the traditional building-to-building sweep. The source added that many Israelis were encouraged by the initial statements by the leaders of Germany, France and England that they would unconditionally support an immediate response, subject to the rule of law. President Biden reiterated this view in an unscheduled speech to the White House Conference of Jewish Leaders on Wednesday, pithily reporting that he recently told Netanyahu it's really important that Israel, for all its anger and bitterness, and I don't even know how to explain it, act according to the rules of war. There are rules for war, too. The option now being considered, according to the Israeli source, involves further isolating Gaza. The power supply would be cut off and food and other vital supplies cut off. Right now, Hamas has enough drinking water for 2 or 3 days, and if provisions start running low, it will kick Hamas out, the source suggested. He said that at some point Israel could negotiate the release of some of the prisoners, primarily women and children, in exchange for food and water. The main dispute today revolved around whether to take Hamas by force or to eliminate up to 100 people in the Gaza Strip, he reported. Israel had assumed that, having received some $1.6 billion from Qatar since 2014, Hamas would claim supreme power and the role of a caring ruler. He continued, but now that President Biden has called them terrorists, Hamas has a reason to soften its bloodthirsty image. There may be a chance to discuss the captives issue calmly and in a balanced way and release some of the Israeli hostages, starting with women and children. Those who remain will be treated as prisoners of war, he said, and their release will be discussed in further negotiations, as has happened in the past. But, the interlocutor added, the more Hamas atrocities are televised, the more it is perceived as another ISIS asterisk, and the less time there is left. The reality, he said, is that Hamas is irrational and incapable of any negotiations, and Qatar is not going to get involved. Thus, unless the international community or third parties intervene, a major land invasion, with untold deaths on all sides and the deaths of all prisoners, cannot be ruled out. The decision to invade in full force lies with Israel, and it has not yet been made.